Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the NYU Law Forum. Today we have, I can't think of a better group to bring before you to talk about the importance of inspectors general, the kind of work they do, the threat that they're currently under given the current administration. So what they all have in common is illustrious careers. They're all brilliant, dedicated public servants. They've all been dismissed in some capacity by Trump. And so I'll just give you some brief bios, and then we'll kind of kick everything right off. So to my immediate left is Glenn Fine. He was the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice for over a decade, and also the Acting Inspector General of the Department of Defense. He is the author of everything you need and want to know about Inspectors General of this book, Watchdogs, which just came out, so it'll give you all the things you need to know up until the stuff we're going to talk about today, which will get you up to speed. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the kinds of things you did in government. And then to his left is Christy Grimm. She was an inspector general at HHS. So she began working there in 1999. So again, we have some really long-serving inspectors general here. She began there. She was an acting inspector general during the first Trump administration. There was an effort to try to name a replacement, but she stayed. She stayed because that replacement did not get through because the nomination was stalled. So she stayed on and became an inspector general, not just acting, during the Biden administration, up until she was dismissed by President Trump in January. She has a Master of Public Administration from the Wagner School here. So also interestingly, we might talk a little bit about some distinctions when you're not a lawyer and you're an inspector general, which might be kind of interesting. And then last but not least, at the far end of the panel is Mark Greenblatt. He was Inspector General at the Department of the Interior from 2019 until 2025. Again, January of 2025 was dismissed by President Trump. He's also the chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. So in that role knows a lot about inspectors general generally and is a graduate of Columbia Law, but we never hold that against people. All right, so what I thought we would do is, so to everybody's on the same page, so inspectors general are watchdogs of federal agencies. They prevent and detect waste, fraud, and abuse. They've been operating since the 1970s. One estimate has credited them with saving $93 billion with a B in fiscal year 2023 alone, and their overall budget is about $3.5 billion. So this is a very cost-effective unit of government. They bring in way more than they cost. But, you know, I would say, no offense to anybody here, they're kind of a little-known part of government. I think it's safe to say most Americans don't really have a great awareness of them or what they do, although some of that might have changed in January to the extent they could compete with other things in the news cycle, because 3 days into his second term, Donald Trump fired more than a dozen, maybe as high as 18. It's a little hard, honestly, to get numbers from different sources of exactly who has been. You all can tell me if you have better numbers than what we've been able to glean. And so the media had lots of reports about this, you know, calling it a Friday night massacre, you know, that this was a huge upheaval. You know, these days there are so many of those that it's hard to say where it falls in a catastrophic government threat cycle, but it's a big one and certainly worth talking about. And when they were dismissed, that they were just received short emails with the reason given being changing priorities, and that was it. So there's a lot to talk about here, but what I thought we'd start with first is just getting a little sense of how these offices function, the kind of work they do, why independence matters to them, you know, what the firings might mean to that independence. We'll turn to the Trump onslaught and what other presidents have thought of IGs as well to get a sense of where they fit, and then lastly, we'll try to figure out where things are headed. There's some litigation, maybe if Congress decided to do things, what they could do. But to start us off, Glenn, I was hoping that you, as the author of this book, could give us maybe just in a few minutes a sense of how the IG structure came about, you know, kind of its brief history and what the major purpose of having IGs in government is.
Certainly, and thank you, Rachel, for moderating this panel and NYU School of Law for having it. Yes, inspectors general are little known. Sometimes they've been called some of the most important public servants you've never heard of. I think that is different now because people have heard of them. They are important independent watchdogs located within each federal agency, 74 in total, whose mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, and abuse and promote the integrity, economy, and efficiency of the agency. They're a relatively recent phenomenon. It started in 1978 statutorily with the Inspector General Act, although military inspectors general have a much longer history in the United States. In fact, there was a military inspector general who was instrumental to the birth of our country. Back during the Revolutionary War, the troops were disheveled, ragtag in Valley Forge, and the Continental Congress appointed an inspector general to come to the United States, Baron von Steuben, to increase the morale, improve the discipline, and inspect the troops. And he did come initially over the objection of Washington, and as a result, the troops left Valley Forge a much more effective fighting force, and he was called indispensable to the victory of the Continental Army. So an inspector general has been around for a long time in the military, but a military inspector general is different than a civilian inspector general. A military inspector general reports to the commander, is the eyes and ears of the commander, and is not independent. And a civilian inspector, and there has been a military inspector general since then in all the services, but a civilian inspector general happened as a result of post-Watergate reforms, good government reforms, including financial disclosure laws, civil service reforms, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act reforms, and then they passed an Inspector General Act over the objection of the administration at the time, who said we don't need that. We already have the Government Accountability Office, but Congress almost unanimously passed one which established an independent inspector general in 12 federal agencies. Some federal agencies at the time opposed it, the Department of Justice, for example, the Department of Defense. The Department of Justice said, well, we're an agency of lawyers, we don't need an inspector general. That argument didn't age very well. Eventually, with amendments to the IG Act in 1982 and 1988, there was an inspector general put into every federal agency, and most of them are, well, half of them are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and the other half are called designated federal entity inspectors general, who are appointed by the agency head. They have a dual reporting responsibility. They report problems both to the agency head and to Congress, but they're supposed to be independent and appointed without regard to political affiliation, based on demonstrated integrity and skill in law, accounting, public administration, investigations. They have the ability to audit, evaluate, or investigate any matter within the agency, and the agency is supposed to cooperate with them. They make public reports, both to Congress and to the agency head, and they are, in essence, the taxpayer's advocate to show transparently how their dollars are being spent. So they normally survive the change of administration. That's why I was an inspector general over several administrations, as was Christie and Mark. But that has been the historic practice, but it did not happen now, and I'm sure we'll get into that as well. So that's the sort of the background of inspectors general and the importance of them, just the independence to be able to audit and evaluate and investigate anything within the agency.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. So maybe, Christy, you can pick up from there and kind of we can get a day in the life of an inspector general at Health and Human Services. So, kind of what drew you to that kind of line of work and how so at HHS, you would have a range of places that you could be looking because it would include the FDA, Center for Disease Prevention, the whole huge behemoth that is HHS. How do you pick priorities among that? What might be a kind of typical or a kind of investigation or pursuit that you would have as IG that would give the audience a feel for kind of the importance of the work? Okay. You can tell a war story if you know.
A war story or just one? I have so many. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm more than happy to be talking about the importance of inspectors general. I was the Inspector General at Health and Human Services, and within my portfolio, our portfolio was the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. which was the biggest on an annual basis. About 1.7 trillion is spent in Medicare and Medicaid alone. In terms of the size of the department, in addition to sort of talking through which offices are there, expenditures during COVID at HHS were around 2.5 trillion. Now it's around 1.9 trillion. So it is a lot of money. And IGs, one of the things that is discussed is, are they appropriately resourced to be able to do what they need to do? And my office at the time had less than 2 cents for every $100 that the department spent. And so we do have to make hard choices. And so some of the things that we consider are risks to programs, risks to beneficiaries. And at some point today, I really want to emphasize, in addition to why IGs matter for that role of independence and credibility and transparency, the work really does benefit people. I like to say to my team at HHS, no matter what you're working on, you can translate that into the lives of anybody that you're speaking to. But we would consider, funding considerations. 80% of what we did was meant to look at Medicare and Medicaid by law. And types of issues that come in through the hotline, through our own data analytics, where we're seeing spikes in billings, or we're getting a sense that a fraud trend is occurring because of something like, we're seeing hospices in California where you've got, one hospice for every 20 people that live in California. That would be a clue that there might not be something right there. So, and then of course, whistleblower referrals, whistleblower retaliation, and a day in the life, looking at the kinds of issues that we're reporting on, talking about our work. That was a really big deal. Something that I'm sure we'll get into is part of that independence is not being able to run a program. I can point out issues to the administrator for CMS, but I can't force them to do anything about it. I can have, I can work with Congress, there can be hearings, but to talk about that work, to follow up on recommendations, that's how we go about getting the impact that occurs. And that was a critical piece of what I did, is zeroing in on priority areas like nursing homes. I talk a lot about how we can't wait to fix what is happening in nursing homes with respect to, infection. They suffered severely during COVID. And so what makes good nursing homes succeed? What makes poor nursing homes struggle? What are the experiences of beneficiaries? Medicare Advantage was another priority for us, in large part because it is, there's Medicaid Advantage in every state. It's a primary service delivery. And in Medicare, over half of Medicare beneficiaries rely on the Medicare Advantage plan. They're enrollees in those plans. And we see billions of dollars that we're concerned about in terms of, do beneficiaries have these diagnoses that the plans are getting paid for, but they're not providing the services that you would expect for things like acute stroke or severe bipolar, or for congestive heart failure, really serious things. And so nursing homes, Medicare Advantage, opioids, big area of deep concern for us. And I have a few war stories to talk about there. And then grants and contracts, because HHS is the #1 grant-giving agency and the #2 contracting entity in the federal government. So big geographic space, a lot of money involved.
Okay, and we'll definitely circle back to some more of this stuff, but I'll let Mark weigh in at this point to tell us a little bit about what being an Inspector General at Interior looks like.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be back in a law school environment. I've done Jennifer Rogers' class a couple of semesters, but that was over Zoom. And it's nice to be back in a law school environment. And you're in a law school environment when the front row is empty. And that just, it brings you back. It feels good. So the key thing things I think to keep in mind in terms of who we are and what we do is that we are the taxpayers' representative. We are your representatives inside the federal agencies. We are there to make sure that they're effective and efficient with the use of your tax dollars, and that they're providing the services that they are obligated to provide to the American public, to whoever is the consumer, if you will. And in that vein, we are independent. We are not beholden to a political administration, to a political party, to a political ideology. We are there to be objective fact finders and compare the efficacy of these various programs, the efficiency of these various programs, regardless of what the policy is. So, for example, I was at the Department of the Interior. Interior has all of the oil and gas extraction under federal land, both onshore and offshore of the outer continental shelf. These are obviously huge controversial issues. Drilling, you have some folks saying drill, baby, drill, and you have some folks who are moving forward towards, climate change activism, right? These are very, very high sensitivity matters. I don't have a dog in that fight as the Inspector General at Interior. I am not there to say drill, baby, drill, or you should be more, more climate friendly. That is not my role. My role is when they implement a program, is it running well? Is it meeting its goals? Is it using the taxpayers' resources efficiently? Is it following the policies and procedures that are laid out for the department? Is there misconduct in the program? But that's a key distinction, is that we are not part of the policy. And the reason why that's important is that if I had a dog in the fight, for example, if I had Facebook posts or I had given speeches with drill, baby, drill, would anyone believe a report that came out under my name from my office on wind energy or solar? No, right? Because I'm coming in with the thumb on the scale toward drill, baby, drill. Or the inverse. If I were very vocal about climate change, would anyone believe my reports that came out about oil and gas extraction, right? No. That's the key. We need to be removed from that kind of political cross currents, from the policy matters at issue. We play in that space, but we are not parties to those matters, if you will. And that is a key perspective for us, to have that level of remove, that we can dispassionately look at these programs as the taxpayers' representatives. Let Congress fight out the policy issue. Let the administration fight out the policy issue. Once that policy is implemented and the programs are designed and implemented, then we come in and look. And so that's I think, an important thing for everyone to understand who we are and what we do and why our role is important.
So I guess I'll start with you, Glenn, and anyone can feel free to weigh in on this, and you can reflect on either defense or justice. But I'm curious how you kind of can maintain the independence and the objectivity if you're working day to day in an agency structure. And maybe you can tell me, like, physically where your office is. Are you mingling with the people you're supposed to oversee? Because I'm just thinking about how hard it is for almost any internal affairs bureau, whether it's a police department or an agency, to kind of not feel a little bit of pressure of getting to know people if you're ultimately going to have to write a report that's going to be very critical of some of the things that people in that agency are doing.
You're right. It's a challenge, and it's a fine line to walk. You want to be independent from the agency, but you don't want to be so isolated that you don't understand what's going on. So you have to communicate with the agency on a regular basis, but you're not the same as other people within the agency. So, for example, we did have an office in the main Justice Building, but most of our employees were in another building. I would meet with the agency leaders. We would brief them on what we were doing, but we would not go to management meetings because we did not want to be part of management meetings where they decided what to do and what the policy should be, because we might have to audit them as well. But we had to be independent from them, and not everyone sort of understands that. I worked with 5 attorneys general in my 11 years in the Justice Department, and I would brief them about the independence of the IG when they first got into office. And I'll never forget the reaction of one of the attorney generals after I told him we were independent and we decide under the IG Act what to audit, evaluate, or investigate. And he looked at me and he scratched his head. He said, "Wait a minute, Glenn. Are you telling me that I can order around everyone else in this building, the main Justice Building, and what to audit, what to investigate, what to evaluate, but I can't do that with you? I said, yes, that's what the IG Act requires. It requires our independence. And he looked at me intently, stared, and he said, okay. He said, if that's what the law says, we follow the law around here. And I was very fortunate that they did, all 5 of them. Now, they didn't love our reports all the time, but they never interfered with the independence of the IG, and that's important as well. And I would tell our employees, we are in the department, but we're not the same as everybody else. We have to maintain a cordial relationship, a professional relationship, but not a personal relationship. And so it's rare, actually, for people to go from the IG's office into to the agency as well. And I think that's important as well. So I think that was we had different reactions from the different attorney generals. They all were different in their policies, but they all sort of understood our role. And I would say one of them, in particular, John Ashcroft, who was the attorney general in the first Bush administration, he actually would tell his staff it's very important to cooperate with the inspector general because they make the agency better. And I remember I was in a meeting once with his staff, and he said, cooperate with the IG. Getting an IG audit or investigation is like going to the dentist. He said, it's painful when you're in the dentist chair, but you come out healthier. And I appreciated that. That was right. The only thing I didn't appreciate was when I was walking around the Justice Department, they would say, here comes the dentist. But I think that was the tone at the top matters. You want to be professional with them, you want to communicate, but you don't want to be too close to the agency head.
And I want the other 2 to weigh in, but one quick follow-up for you is you had mentioned that some of the IGs are appointed and by the president, nominated and confirmed by the
Yeah.
Senate, and some are picked by the agency head.
Right.
Do you think that makes a difference in terms of that ability to maintain independence if they're actually selected by the agency head, or do you think this kind of norm of independence is about the same regardless of how they're selected?
I think it makes it a little more challenging, but it really depends on the individual. It really is the individual who determines how they act, how independent to be. The president can fire the presidentially appointed IGs, and the agency head can fire the agency head appointed IGs, but it really matters how you approach the job. And it reminds me of a story. When I was the acting Defense Department Inspector General, I heard General Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense, tell this story. And he said when he first became the Secretary of Defense, he was at Stanford. He said, as he said it, happily corrupting the youth of America. And he went to he was a Marine, and he went to this, he called the senior Marine on campus at the time, and that was George Shultz, former Secretary of State, and asked for advice. And George Shultz told him, you have to do this job as if you don't want it that much, meaning you have to be able to do it knowing you can be fired at any time, and take that as a given. And if you are, that's part of the role, but you just have to be independent and be willing to speak truth to power, even if it's a difficult message that you're imparting to people.
So Mark, Christy, do you want to maybe share with us some moments where you faced pushback, you felt the threats against your independence, how you handled it?
Sure. I think Glenn said the word communication, and I think that's the key thing. Communicating with both the agency leadership, in my case, the Secretary of the Interior, but also the folks in Congress. They are our main consumers of our reports and our oversight efforts, and so they have a very big stake in what we do and our independence, and so we would communicate with them directly about those challenges that we were facing. And you just have to stick with the law and stick with the facts, and when that pushback happens, you engage, and it's okay to disagree. You can, that's a part of the nature of the beast, is that you're going to have these moments where you want to come out with these certain findings, and the agency just vigorously disagrees with you, and that's okay. You put it in your report so that the rest of the world can see, and the policymakers can make their own judgment. You're not going to be the most popular person. You're going to be the dentist in Glenn's analogy, and you just have to know that. Some people call us the skunk at the picnic, which I don't love that one, but that's how some people view us. The way that I characterized it is, at the Department of the Interior, and I know that they did this. I used to work for Glenn at the Department of Justice. Justice does this as well, where each of the components has their own holiday party. So the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, all these subcomponents would have their own holiday parties, and they would invite everyone in the department to come. And I remember thinking to myself, we should do that, but no one would go. But that's just you have to appreciate that you're not there to be popular. You're not there to be, loved by everyone. You're there to be fair, objective, and independent. And the sense of community that we get is really from the other OIGs, the other inspectors general, and the 14,000 people that work in the various offices of inspector general throughout the federal government. And that's where we would find our sense of community, and our, that's where we would go for sort of comfort, if you will, as leaders, to compare notes and that sort of thing, and that helped us keep that that arm's length, but not disagreeable, but just arm's length professional relationship with the agencies.
And Christy, if you could weigh in on it, but also I'm curious how, since in a way your weapon is information and reports, you had mentioned before that part of what you did was kind of go out there and try to publicize them or get people to support. What kinds of things did you find to be most effective in kind of getting, to maintain your independence and have like a platform where you could really speak what you had to say, even if the agency didn't love it, and maybe cultivate relationships, whether it's with people in Congress or the press, or just how you saw the job in terms of being the most effective IG?
Okay. I will start with talking about leadership at the department and the importance of the tone that an AG sets, or a secretary might set, because it is very effective for them to recognize that what we do is essentially a blueprint for what could be done better, and we're there to sort of put risks in front of them, of Congress, with the whole idea that we do want the programs to run as efficiently, as effectively, and to be rid as much as possible of fraud, waste, and abuse. And there are a whole variety of ways to try to interfere within IG. I have been very fortunate. The secretaries at HHS do respect what the HHS IG does, and I do think that tone is very important. I believe Glenn describes it as, we're independent but not untethered. And in the healthcare space in particular, the kinds of programs that we would be looking at, they're large, they're complex, they're technical, and to be able to have access to people and information, to sort of get that information right, is critically important, of course. But there are many different, I think, points of negotiation. As an IG, we need to be able to have access, and by law, to, all means all, to people, to information. And sometimes there's a push to maybe slow walk that, or, having to have conversations about, no, all means all, and we need access to this information. And, to have that good, trusted, respected reputation is very good. And, we'll probably get into this, but, any attempts to infuse what IGs do with partisanship is really damaging to this idea of being, trusted and credible, and, that we access this information to gather facts, to communicate whether programs are operating well, what needs to be done better. And what was your second part of your question, Rachel?
Just how you cultivated support for some of the policy prescriptions you might like to see made, because as you said, you don't really have any authority to say to the agency, you really should be doing this.
One of the things that I emphasized is to a secretary, deputy secretary, to assistant secretaries is, I never want you to be surprised. At HHS, our work plan was public. What we were doing in the audit space, what we were doing in the evaluation space. Now, investigations is a whole other thing. We're not making them aware of all of the fine points around what we're investigating. But to be able to sort of have have that ability to sort of, access that information, and people is important. And I keep forgetting your last piece.
No,
I'm
no,
so
it's fine.
sorry.
Actually, maybe what I'll do is, we can get back to that one too, but I do have one more thing to ask all of you. So some of you
Yeah.
might be thinking, how are you different than Doge?
Yeah.
Because a lot of what
Okay.
you're describing is access to large pieces of information, trying to find inefficiencies. And any of you can kind of weigh in on how you view Doge, how it intersects,
Okay.
if it does at all, with IGs.
Let me just finish this one point, so how we got things done. So if, if they're seeing for the first time that we're doing a report on a system that was, people were able to manipulate information in there and grants went out to people that they weren't supposed to, if they're just hearing about that for the first time when, the draft report comes to them, it's my sense that that is not helpful. And, in the IG Act, we have these processes where we're, and practices within our own organizations where we announce what we're going to do. We're going to sit down with the agency. We're going to tell them what we're going to be accessing. And so all of that sort of creates a sense of, okay, this might be a perceived vulnerability for the Inspector General, and we're going to be, looking at that as well. And then when we have the recommendations coming out, it's never helpful to just sort of release a report and then do nothing with that afterward. To be able to have follow-up on those recommendations, to be able to talk about it publicly when there's, something that may not be well understood, to engage with the media to make sure there's more clarity around some of these complex issues.
Do you want to weigh in on
Yeah, so
how, if at all, any of this is or is not the same as Doge?
Yeah, well, I'll get to the Doge thing. You were asking about how we leverage our relationships and that sort of thing to affect change. I'll give you one very quick example, just to show you what we do and how we can affect positive change. Even though we can't do it ourselves, we have to rely on the agency to do so. We issued a report in which the Bureau of Land Management wasn't doing a very small check. Basically, they were giving out leases without checking whether these people were barred from doing business with the federal government. So over time, as we find contractors and grant recipients that are not presently, it's called presently responsible. Basically, there's something fundamentally wrong with them. They've had misconduct in the past or something like that, and they're barred from doing business with us. Well, we had a federal entity, the Bureau of Land Management, that wasn't checking this list, which is publicly available. It's on websites that you all can access. And they weren't just checking the names against them before giving them grants, before giving them leases. And so we wrote this report, and they said it was going to take, get this, 2 years to implement that change. Mind you, you could do this sitting right here, right now on your computer. We said 2 years seems like an excessive amount of time for this. That's your call. But we did notify Congress. Congress then wrote a letter and said to the Bureau of Land Management, we're going to have a hearing with you and the Inspector General on this issue. Within 2 weeks, they implemented the change that we had recommended. What they had said would be 2 years was done before the hearing happened in 2 weeks, right? So that is how we can leverage our relationship with Congress and the media or what have you to affect that kind of positive change. Now, with respect to Doge, what did you say?
I said awareness matters.
Yeah.
If you drop a report and no one reads it, what kind of impact can we expect to achieve?
That's exactly right. A tree falling in a forest kind of thing. If no one's around to pay attention to it, it just kind of it can get forgotten. Now, in terms of Doge, there are a number of differences with respect to what we do and what they do. We look at individual programs in great detail. We dive in, our auditors, our investigators, our inspectors dive in and get very, very up close and personal, both with the individuals at play and also with the programs, and get a very global sense of what's happening within that specific program, as opposed to Doge, which is acting in a very, very broad way, looking at sort of whole departments, whole sections of grants, and just moving forward very, very large. There are other differences as well. One is transparency. When we write a report, when we have findings, we share it with the agency, and we give the agency an opportunity to comment. We want to make sure that we're right. We want to make sure that the stakeholders, Congress and the American public, have a view on our perspective on this, but also the agency's perspective, and then they can make policy decisions going forward, like BLM, We said, you guys need to make this change. They said it was going to take 2 years. And Congress was like, we want to ask you about that. Boom, they changed real fast, right? Well, that's the value you get in that transparency, is that there is this dialogue that stakeholders can get involved with. Right now with DOGE, there's no transparency in that regard. It's only after a contract is cut are they putting it online, and you don't know what was the contract about. You don't, there's very little information in that regard. Also with respect to their processes, ours is all very transparent. It's on the web for the audit side of our house, not for the investigations, but for the audit side of the house. And so I think that reporting, that transparency, the deep dive that we're doing on each element, those are very significant differences. The final thing I would say, and I don't want to hog the mic, the final thing I would say is our motivation, and Christy alluded to this just a second ago, our motivation is to make the department better. Our motivation is to make the programs as good for the American taxpayers as possible, as good for you all as possible. DOGE, and this is their mandate from the president, so I'm not denigrating it, seems to be to cut. Ours wasn't to cut. You know what I mean? Like, ours wasn't one-sided. We were not hammers looking for nails. If the program was working well and delivering for the American people, we would say the program is working well and delivering for the American people. And whereas I think DOGE's mindset is to cut, solely to cut. And so I think that's a distinction. Again, I'm not denigrating it. That's a policy choice for the president, for the American people. But those are differences. I would say those are the big differences between what the inspectors general do and what DOGE is doing.
And if anyone else wants to weigh in before we shift.
I think I agree with Mark that DOGE has a different mandate. It seems to be cutting agencies and programs and contracts, and it's hard to do that without really knowing what goes on in those programs and agencies the way an IG does it. So when DOGE first came in, I think IGs were optimistic and hopeful that they would consult with the IGs. The IGs and the Government Accountability Office has a lot of experience in understanding where there's waste, fraud, and abuse in government, and there clearly is. The GAO has a high-risk list which shows where they're concerned about, and IGs know how the programs are being worked. But from what I understand, DOGE has not interacted much with IGs, and as Mark said, his mandate is to cut significantly, and that's hard to do with a scalpel, and it's more of a broad brush approach than an IG's approach as well.
So I guess related to DOGE coming in and not working with the inspectors general, one reason for that might be the mass firings of the IGs that took place when Trump came in. So I want to pivot a little bit. And just to give people historical context, although this was definitely a very sweeping dismissal, we have historically had other presidents come in and take the view that they wanted to get rid of IGs. So Ronald Reagan fired 16 of them when he took office in 1981. But in his case, Congress objected to that, and he did rehire 5 of them. George W. Bush also attempted to fire all the IGs when he took office, but he relented, again, because Congress objected. And, well, I put the Barack Obama dismissed one IG, although I put that in a different category because that person, I guess, had become disoriented at a meeting, and it was just the one. And then again, in the first Trump administration, he tried to remove in various ways 5 IGs the first time. So it's historically we have precedent for presidents coming in and wanting to remove IGs, and I guess in particular Republican presidents taking an interest in that. And so one, I just would like to get your reaction as to why they would have that attitude, why they would want to come in and think, yes, this is a group of people, because given everything you've said, it seems almost like it's all upside. It makes the agency work better, whatever the agency's policies are. It's detecting waste, fraud, and abuse and saving taxpayer dollars. So from the president's perspective, why would they want these people gone? And what, if anything, is different about what President Trump just did from what President Reagan and G.W. Bush wanted to do in their time in office?
Well, you're right. You described the precedent. The IG Act was passed in 1978, and the first presidential transition was President Reagan, and he asked for the resignations of all political appointees appointed by the president, and he didn't make any distinctions for IGs. And there was a hubbub by Congress saying, no, IGs are different, and you should keep them. And he relented and hired five of them back. And since then, when the administration has changed, there has not been a mass firing of IGs. although some may want to do that, you always want, I guess there's an inclination to want to put your own people in, people who are more loyal to you. But people have recognized the value of independent IGs, and Congress has stood up and said IGs should remain. There were a few firings, as you mentioned, until sort of the end of the Trump administration, and President Biden fired one as well, but not a mass firing. And then when President Trump came in, he fired, I think, 17, and left only a few in place, and that chills independent IGs. And he has not nominated many to replace them, so the offices are still being run, but it undermines the concept of an independent IG when you remove them and try and put in people who are more loyal to you. And I think that's a challenge and a chilling effect on the independent role of an IG.
And why do you suppose that, so in the prior historical examples that I gave, Congress pushed back, and it seems like this, I should say there is a law that requires the president to give 30 days notice to Congress if he wants to remove an IG with an explanation as to why, and that has obviously been violated in the case of the current administration. And there was a letter that was written by Senators Grassley and Durbin asking, where's our notice, what happened? But other than that, they've been very quiet, Congress. And so it's not like the response that we saw during the Reagan or the George W. Bush administration. So why isn't Congress finding this to be a valuable service that they should be trying to protect and preserve?
So if I can chime in, yes, their response has been utterly tepid, and I think that's the most charitable interpretation you can make. And the proverbial strongly worded letter, which has never had any kind of follow-up or anything like that, is utterly worthless from my perspective. If they wanted to, they have the full arsenal of tools that they could use to effectuate, whatever kind of change they wanted to see. I'm talking about Congress. Certainly in the Senate, they can hold nominees. They can stop hearings on nominees. They can do a wide variety. They can affect budgets, appropriations, what have you. They've done none of that. So I think calling it tepid is actually quite charitable. They've done nothing.
I would interject, though, for the litigation. There was an amicus brief from Senate Democrats supporting IGs, supporting their independence, talking about why they matter, talking about why removal process matters, talking about the history of how Congress did, in the instance of President Reagan, I believe, but I'm not sure, talked about President Obama, engage with the president to explain, why that work matters, and highlighted all that they know about IGs and really doubled down on these are effective IGs who are doing work on behalf of the American people and improving programs, and they have demonstrable results. So I would quibble with the characterization that they've done absolutely nothing.
That's a good clarification. I was talking about the Republicans who control both houses, and therefore they control the committee mechanisms. You're right. I think the Democrats, by and large, some of them have been vocal and trying to do things, but right now the only game in town is on the Republican side, and so that's what I was talking about, Christy. So thank you for clarifying. You're totally right. Now, in terms of why I think the Republicans over the years have had some of this bristling with the IGs, is I think they have, there's no secret, there's a fundamental distrust of the sort of the federal bureaucracy. And I think they are concerned about, trusting folks who are in those positions, who they, as Glenn was talking about, don't have control over in terms of what they audit, what their findings are. And I think that you as a leader have to have trust that that person is going to act, that office is going to act in a fair, objective, independent manner. And I think they come in the door many times not having that trust. And so there's this natural, I think there's this natural bristling at times. And so that's why I think it's on one side as opposed to the other more so. But I would say this, in terms of the history and the precedent, I would say the precedent of what happened with President Reagan actually cemented the apolitical status of IGs. As Glenn was saying, when Congress there was a big hue and cry when he fired, I think it was 12, maybe it was 15, I thought it was 12 at the time. They ended up hiring back half of them to come back in. And from that point forward, we've never seen any firings related to the transitions. Zero, literally zero. The removals that we've seen have been related to, at least ostensibly, related to misconduct or a lack of confidence for some substantiated reason. Now, we can disagree about that on certain individual cases like Steve Linick at the State Department, but that was at least ostensibly for some sort of reason. Again, I don't agree with it, but there was at least a reason about, say, Steve. For the 17 of us who were removed, there was no reason like that stated. It was just changing priorities. That was in the email to me. That was in the email to Christie. Well, that's exactly what the IGs should not be removed for. We shouldn't be removed for changing priorities, liking the example I gave about the Department of the Interior, them going from climate, concerns about climate change to drill, baby, drill shouldn't affect us, right? So the changing of that kind of priority shouldn't be at issue for us. And so that's something that's concerning, is when that's cited, as opposed to in the Biden administration, there was a removal of an IG following a report of substantiated allegations of misconduct. And that is exactly how the process is supposed to work. Not all IGs are saints and angels, and so it's appropriate, and we need to have folks that are engaged in misconduct or have made bad decisions removed from office. That needs to be a mechanism for the president. But this was not that, and that's why this is significant, is because these removals had nothing to do with us as in terms of executing our job. It was the president wanting to bring in his own person into these positions.
So let me ask you, so as I'm hearing you give the answer, obviously, if I put on my devil's advocate unitary executive hat for
Yes.
a minute, I would imagine that there are some people who have that view that would say, it actually is changing priorities is a valid reason, because, there's one executive branch, there's a president at the top of it, these IGs are still in it, even if they are supposed to have kind of a norm of independence, and so they can keep their norm of independence. Let's say a president said, what if the letter elaborated a little more? And instead of saying changing priorities, said, you can pick from a variety of things that you want to investigate and audit. You have a lot of discretion. And I would like to put in my people in that role to exercise that discretion, because I'm the unitary executive and I should have, and we'll talk about whether or not by law, it'll have to be that they're, removable, because Humphrey's executor might be going, and there's going to be a whole collapse of anyone in the executive branch that has for-cause removal restrictions. But what do you make of that view? Like, just the idea that if someone holds that view, is there any role for IGs to kind of continue this norm where they're going to stay on administration to administration, or is it actually fundamentally incompatible?
So,
And any
go
of
on,
you
Glenn.
can.
So that is what's at issue with the lawsuit. 8 IGs who were removed filed a lawsuit,
And Christie is one of the people that's
right, saying that the president didn't follow the IG Act, which allows the president to remove an IG, but in an amendment in 2022, a bipartisan amendment, requires the president to give a specific articulable reason with articulable basis with case-specific reasons, I think, something like that, which has to give this case-specific reason. So it allows the president to remove an IG, but just wait 30 days and give the reason so that Congress can try and persuade the president not to. It does, if you remove an IG, if all of them are removed each time a president changes, it does, in some sense, politicize the IG and makes it more a political position rather than an independent position. But that's the issue in the lawsuit, whether the unitary executive theory makes any restrictions on a removal of an IG unconstitutional. And we'll have to see what happens in this case, what the court will say. But the court is moving towards limiting Congress's ability to restrict the president from removing an IG. I'm not sure that's a great thing, because IGs and the independence and the non-politicization is an important attribute of IGs, but we'll see what the court says about whether the unitary executive theory allows the president to do that.
And Christy, maybe you should weigh in, I mean, to the extent you can talk about just what the claims in the litigation are from the perspective of the plaintiffs. So you don't have to give a prediction of what might happen, but is it just about the notice and the insufficient reasons and kind of any other arguments that have been made as part of the litigation?
Yes, the way that the IGs were dismissed in a 2-sentence email that didn't give any case-specific information for the dismissals, it cited policy, changing priorities in the email, and largely I agree that as priorities change, as they do from administration to administration, we're looking at are the programs running well? Are what law is being broken? We certainly sit down with the administrations to say, what keeps you up at night, so that our work plan, certainly at HHS, was informed as we looked at program and operations and where things can be improved. So the cited reason was changing priorities, and we are, and that you are terminated effective immediately. And so we're saying, that is not the way the law says that an IG is terminated. And we are asking that, if that was unlawful in the way that we were terminated, that we be allowed to go back to doing the work that we were doing, among a couple other areas of relief. But that's what we're saying, that a president has the right to terminate an IG. In fact, there are many instances where an IG should be terminated, and in this instance, though, the law was not followed, and we're contesting the terminations.
So I just want to tease out your hypothetical a little bit about the changing priorities. It's a really interesting question. For example, if a new president came in and said, I want you, meaning me as the IG at the Department of the Interior, to focus on waste, fraud, and abuse in the National Park Service. And I said, well, no, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Bureau of Land Management is much higher risk, and I'm going to focus there. Could he remove me in that sense of changing priorities? Would that be as offensive? I actually I was quite vocal at the initial stages of the firings because I actually was contemplating that, saying I was giving him the benefit of the doubt, and I wrote in some of these op-eds, here's how you'll know if he's changing priorities in that sense or in the sense of trying to undermine independence. And we're seeing some of those play out now. And so I think the hypothetical that you're raising is very interesting. I don't think it's applying now, in the sense that I don't think this was a good faith discussion of, I want you to focus on the National Park Service and you're focusing on Bureau of Land Management, which I can understand that. I'd have to think about that and tease that out a little bit. Maybe that's some research projects for some of the folks here. But I laid out how we could tell. And one of the key things is looking at who he nominates in our place. And he just submitted 2 nominees, and I've been quite vocal about these 2 nominees being the opposite of what the American taxpayer should want. These are folks with heavy partisan experience, which is anathema to who we are and what we do. They have policy experience in the very areas that they would be overseeing, which is, again, anathema to who we are and what we do, because it looks like their reports will have a thumb on the scale. And so anyways, so I think the hypothetical is really, really interesting. And the devil's advocate, I appreciate it, because it does, these issues will arise as the Supreme Court is contemplating unified executive theory. These very issues will come into play. But I think in this situation, this was to undermine the independence of the inspectors general, as opposed to a good faith changing of priorities in the bona fide sense.
Just out of curiosity, how would you react, or do you know of any instance where a president has tried to speak directly to an IG? Has there ever been an example where the president has said, I'd like to have a meeting with the IG and talk about the priorities? I'm imagining no, but maybe I'm wrong. And if a president did do that, how would you react to that in your roles as IG? How would you think about it? I'm thinking about U.S. attorneys and kind of the norm of independence there, and if it's similar.
So I'm not aware of that happening. It didn't happen to me when I was the IG at Justice for 11 years, or the acting IG at DOD. And I probably, if I got a call from the president, would say, you should probably call the Secretary of Defense or the Attorney General, not me. But it's never really happened that way, where they've tried to reach down and try to influence the work of the Inspector General, which is why it's important. And in terms of the last question, if IGs are changed at every change of administration, they become like every other political person, and that will color the way people view the reports as being dispassionate, based on the facts, based on the evidence, and that's the coin of the realm for an IG. Trust. Trust that you're doing this based on the facts and the evidence, not for political purposes. And if you don't have that credibility, if it's undermined just by the way you're appointed with each change of administration, I think that undermines the concept of an IG, whether it's legal or not. We'll find out by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I guess the meta question then is, the IG, like so many other branches of our government and how things work, there's a norm that we have kind of all recognized is really important, of independence for it to have validity, which I would say is one we would think about for the Department of Justice, where you were in the Inspector General, and the idea that it's not going to be politicized. There's sort of kind of norms of independence that are being kind of smashed right and left. And so if you couldn't just rely on the norm and the value, is there anything that could be done to fortify IGs against something like this? I mean, assuming that they're not just held unconstitutional, in which case, that's a significant problem to doing that. But anything more that could be done to protect IGs beyond kind of stating what their value is and hoping that people see it?
It's hard if the court rules that the president has the authority to do it under the unitary executive theory. I think the only thing that could potentially work is if Congress, as Mark was saying, stood up and made clear that they supported the role of an independent IG. But if it's ultimately in the president's authority, statutory authority, and it's just a norm that prevents it, I'm not sure how you can change that.
And I would add that it depends on what the Supreme Court says. How broad is the opinion? How bright line is it? Is there a test involved that gives Congress some wiggle room to exercise its Article I authority to limit the president's Article II authority to run the executive branch? If it's clear, bright line, no, nothing is doable, then no. I think the answer to your question is probably no. But if there is wiggle room, then it depends on what Congress can do in that space, in that gray area. And so it's unknowable. I would argue the answer, if they do come down with an opinion, is unknowable at this point about what Congress can do. We just have to see where this plays out in the courts, and then Congress can adapt to that.
Christy, was there any thought given to the extent you could talk about it, to the thought of, should we bring a lawsuit right now about independence in light of the fact that this is a Supreme Court that seems to be gunning for really robust executive powers? And if you can't comment on it, then you can talk about it in a more hypothetical sense. But I know, at other independent agencies where people had for-cause removal protections, like at the NLRB, there was some discussion among legal scholars, like, do you just kind of take the hit and the fact you lost your job and maybe hope that this doesn't get challenged in the Supreme Court right now? Because this court is likely to potentially issue a sweeping decision that might be very bad for the institution overall. Or is it's so important as a matter of principle that you gotta make the fight, even if it turns out that you're going to lose it? I don't know if that was part of the discussion, or how IGs generally think about whether this litigation strategy, pluses and minuses for bringing lawsuits.
I'll just talk about it for my personal decision-making is the way that I'll take that question. Here's how I see it. As inspectors general, we look at something from here's what the law says, and here's how things are happening against that, or here's a regulation, here's how things are playing out in the context of that regulation, and providing that information, and maybe investigating whether, what's the cause there, and, what are the larger considerations if things aren't working very well. And so I consider myself and all IGs to be professional rule followers. And so in this, and no one calls me the dentist, but plenty of people called me, oh, here comes Grim, right? But so we're professional rule followers, and when a rule, a law that was specifically written for IGs that says you can fire an IG, but you need to have this process being followed and this information being part of that. When that is not followed, and then what you can divine from that in terms of potential interference, because there's been a lot of discussion around, what was done could be viewed as an act of interference, which is what the IG Act contemplated, and and certain empowerment provisions that have come about over time. We wrote a law to ensure that they're independent. We refined that law to have certain processes that need to happen for their dismissal. And my decision making was, if I can't stand up for that, if we can't stand up for that, what damage does that have to the IG Act? And so that was the some of the discussions that were happening, and I'll leave it to others if they would like to speculate about the Supreme Court.
I don't know if anybody else wants to
I
weigh in.
guess the only other thing I would add is it's not that the law doesn't allow the president to remove an IG. It's required to give reasons, articulable basis with case-specific reasons, and wait 30 days. And even then, the president can remove an IG immediately under certain circumstances. So the question is whether a notice requirement is acceptable as opposed to preventing the president from removing an IG. And so a notice requirement may survive constitutional challenge, and we'll see.
So I guess I'll ask one last question and then open it up if you all have questions and want to think about them. But I guess in terms of what you're seeing, and Mark, you alluded to this, of the kind of people that the president has nominated to fill some of these vacancies. You had mentioned that they look like partisans. It doesn't look like they fit the model of what we've looked at before. If he were to put in a whole slate of people like that, and then let's say there's a new president that comes in, a Democrat wins in 4 years, would you say that person should remove the people who had just put in because they're partisan? And how do we stop that cycle? Because it does seem like that's a bit of a dilemma for you want the independence and you want to establish a norm, and yet if all the people that have been put in this time around are partisans,
It's a problem, and I've said this over and over again quite publicly, that's the thing that keeps me up at night, is this large existential question. As the chair of the Council of Inspectors General, we would host delegations from all over the world, third world countries, developing countries that are trying to develop their government accountability mechanisms. And they come here and they see the Inspector General community that we built, and they marvel at it. And it was a point of pride for me to share, as an American, this is what we've got. These are the belts and suspenders that we have. And, I would describe it, and they would say, how can we do that? How can we adopt that type of process, that type of function in the in their countries? And to see that potentially going down the drain is very, very troubling, because you're right. If the next administration comes in, be it Republican or Democrat, likely the Democrats would have a greater problem with this if they're sort of perceived to be partisan Republicans. How do they keep those people in office? I mean, Glenn was talking about trust, and and I mentioned it earlier as well. That's a critical part of who we are and what we do. The American public has to trust what we're saying, and if we have a heavy partisan background, or policy advocacy on the issues that we're opining on as oversight professionals, that's going to create a huge problem. I don't see how you get out of the vicious cycle. I would just hope that these folks that if they do get in office that don't appear to have, a bipartisan or apolitical background, maybe they can rise to the challenge. I don't think I think that the clouds are dark and stormy in that regard.
Okay, on that note, if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, you could step up to either microphone if you have one.
Hi, you all. Thank you for your time. My name is Morgan Smith. I'm a first-year student here. I'm sure there are a number of us here who have also applied for the anti-corruption externship next spring, so we're crossing our fingers. Given what you all just talked about, is there any advice you all might have for new attorneys thinking about a career in this field for how to avoid anathema when thinking of trajectory, or given how unique your position is, if there are any skills that you all look for in new attorneys?
Well, I guess I would say part of the reason I wrote this book was to encourage students to think about public service, because public service has tremendous satisfaction. And I think you should continue to look for public services in a way that you feel you can contribute. Obviously, if you're asked to do something that you find immoral or illegal or just anathema to your values, then that's a problem. But there are plenty of places in government where the work goes on and it's insulated from politics. We are looking for people who have a good, obviously academic background, but have good writing abilities and are interested in contributing to public service. So I am in favor of it on whatever level, federal, state, local level. There's all sorts of opportunities for that, and it gives you tremendous psychic satisfaction. It may not be the most lucrative field to choose, and I know many people have debts, but if you can do it, I think that public service is a tremendous calling.
Anyone else?
In the healthcare space, I think that there are so many possibilities. And one of the things that we looked at when hiring attorneys is, do you have practical experience in the real world? And I think that matters a whole heck of a lot than when you then go into government to have that experience. A piece of advice that I would have for anybody that's interested in going into law in government is to pay very close attention to what's going on with administrative law right now, because there are so many changes, right to a jury trial, the overturning Chevron. I mean, there's a lot that you should be paying attention to, and it's changing quite a bit.
So if I could offer a bit of advice, just on a couple of practical levels. One, writing. The quality of your writing matters. It is something I would spend disproportionate amount of time perfecting. It's just so important, especially as a lawyer, to write well. So I would encourage you all to focus on that aspect just as a practitioner. The other thing I would say, and this is something I offer in Jennifer's class when I speak with them, is look for opportunities to distinguish yourself. So you have to be good at your job, whatever job it is. But there are going to be a lot of people who are doing that job likely, and the way I think more junior folks can stretch their legs is by distinguishing yourself. And I'll give an example. When I worked for Glenn at the Department of Justice, I was much more junior than many of the attorneys that were there who were hyper talented. And I said, how can I distinguish myself? How can I, I felt like a lemming, like there were a million lemmings and I felt like one of them. And
I wish we had a million.
Yeah, right. It's actually
that.
30 in
Not
that
even
office.
close,
But yeah. But one of the things that I discovered is I was doing a case involving conflicts of interest. It's statutory provision 18 U.S.C. 208, right? So 208 is the federal conflict of interest, financial felony. And there wasn't a ton of legal research out there about that, and not a lot of case law. And so I did this case where I did an enormous amount of research. And so I had this stack of papers about it, opinions from the Office of Government Ethics, from the Office of Legal Counsel, all these different things. And at the end of the case, I was like, well, I got this whole thing, and no one in the world has this. Like, this is important in our space, but there was nothing that summarized it. So I wrote an article published in the Journal of Public Inquiry, which was the IG outward-facing journal, analyzing Section 208. And that distinguished me. Later, I had a false statements matter investigation that I led. And so I wrote an article for the ABA Criminal Justice Journal about false statement law and how it manifests itself. That was another distinguishing factor. So I was no longer just a lemming.
And undoubtedly, that's what led you to being an IG.
That was
Those
what
two
led me to be
articles.
an IG.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what it was.
No, but that is, one of the branches where I think I was promoted up because of taking advantage of those strategic moments where you can distinguish yourself. And so those are the two things I would say as a young, as someone starting out your career is writing, and look for strategic opportunities to distinguish yourself as a professional. Now, in terms of public service, I would strongly encourage it. I went to the law firms. I was trying to be a prosecutor at SDNY or EDNY or whatever it is in the New York area, so I went to the big firms, and I was doing fine. But ultimately, I found that I wasn't getting enough for me out of those positions. And so I switched to government and started doing investigations at the US Senate and fell in love. And that's when I realized I needed a sense of not necessarily green income, but moral income. And what I mean by that was what I was doing at the law firms wasn't immoral, it was amoral, right? I was only arguing this because those clients hired us before these clients hired us. And that was amoral to me. I wasn't compelled by what I was arguing or what I was working on. And I realized I needed some moral income, that I needed to feel like I was getting up every morning, like I was fighting the good fight. And so that's something I think you need to think about. Do you need that? What drives you? And if that moral income is a piece, then public service is calling your name.
We have time for one more if anybody else has a question.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and speaking to us today. My name's Tay. I'm also a 1L. I'm curious, you all kind of touched upon this. I know that the idea from the conception of IGs is to be independent, is to be nonpartisan. However, we're in a nation where we're continually radicalizing. The public is very polarized right now. Is this a relic of the past? Is this, how can we move forward from this administration? I would love you all to just kind of elaborate on how do we promote independent thinking? Is that even possible right now? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Anyone want to take the lead on this one? And we have like 3 minutes, so everybody can have about a minute each on
So
that
I think
massive question.
I think that's a really good question, and in some sense, we are such a polarized country that it's hard to maintain that bipartisan aspect of it, and IGs may be the last vestige of that. And who knows, my book may be a history book as opposed to a book about what's happening in the future. But I do think it's an important concept. We need to talk about it, promote it, and hopefully it will have some resonance and remain. And I think IGs are critically important, and the only way that they can be effective is if they are viewed in a bipartisan way. And so it's a challenge right now. There's no question about it.
And just to add to that, a lot of what I've said is about process, and process matters. And the vetting process for how we arrive at a qualified inspector general, that process is very much meant to determine, are you trustworthy? Can you do your work in a nonpartisan way? Are you going to be able to call the balls and strikes and not have it be interfered with from a political perspective? And so the IGs were meant to do that, and to the extent that that independence and nonpartisanship is preserved, I think there is a better shot, certainly in government, in making sure that things are running as well as they can be, for taxpayers who have invested in them, and so. Hopefully, IGs, as they're sort of currently divined, continue to exist, and that process is continuing to ensure that we've got a nonpartisan person leading that charge.
So I appreciate the question. This sort of gets to what I was saying about keeping me up at night. This is the existential issue. I will say I think our country has gone through ebbs and flows of heavy polarization. Over time, we've always emerged, and it's not pretty, We had times when House members were literally beating each other on the floor of the House, literally, and with a cane. I'd like to think that we are in one of those ebbs or flows, whichever way is the wrong way. But it's dark in that sense. But I am optimistic that eventually the value that we add as IGs will emerge. There are standards at play in terms of our work that we are judged on, the standards that the work needs to meet, and unless those standards are eviscerated, that will tell us that we can have some comfort in what's coming out of these offices. But hopefully, Congress will ultimately, may not be in the next 2 years, maybe not in the next 4 years, but ultimately, I think Congress will hopefully realize the value that they get as the primary consumers and sort of right the ship.
Well, I want to thank you not just for this panel today, but for your outstanding government service. One of the things that really pains me in seeing people terminated from positions is the unbelievably large number of outstanding public servants that we are lucky to have in this country. So I thank you for your service. I thank you for your time on this panel today, and I hope the audience will join me in that.
Thank you. Thank you.